So we're going to break this all down today, and joining me to do that, we have trial attorney Bob Hille as well as trial attorney Andrew Cherkasky. Guys, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Angelica.
Great to be here, Angelica.
All right, let's talk about this quickly because we want to go back there live when it resumes. But until then, Bob, I'll ask you, what do you think about this interview you've seen thus far? I know you've been sitting here before we got on the set and we're watching and listening a little bit. This is going to be key in this trial.
Well, the statements of the defendant are what there seem to resting the case on for the state. How the jury, this is going to play to the jury, what's interesting is the officer's making some statements that are sort of instructional on the law to the witness. She's responding, and the defendant's response is sort of adopting some of those statements, which negate some of the charges they have in the case. So that'll be interesting to see how the jurors respond to that. Also, what you have here is she's young. She's in a confined surrounding. You can see it's a small room, no windows. It was a traumatic event, as we'll find out from some of the other testimony in the trial or statements she's made to others in the trial. She clearly has no escape. When she wanted to leave, they wouldn't let her leave. And the interviewer, although trying to do it gently, is making it clear to her that he's going to continue to pursue his questionings until he gets what he wants from her.
Right, and going off that, I think that's really interesting that you brought that up because he's really peppering her with questions as well as statements. He's not only asking her questions, he's just saying things to her kind of plainly and seeing how she reacts to those. Andrew, while watching this interview, you know, do you think that this officer goes a little overboard or crosses the line at all with how he's talking to her and questioning her?
Well, it doesn't cross the line, I think, in terms of what's legal or what's appropriate under the law in terms of what I see day in, day out. But what I am seeing more and more from juries is lower tolerance for these kind of strong-arm tactics of police that you're not going to leave until you tell us. That sort of idea. Juries tend to be more forgiving, especially of people who are in vulnerable positions, like somebody who's young, somebody who is not particularly sophisticated in their dealings with police. So I think that this is something that may not hit as strong for the prosecution as they would like it to, especially given some of the defense's strong arguments in opening statements about this interview.
And what about how he is kind of, the officer questioning her, relating this back? He talks and relates this to his own daughter having been pregnant and gone through a pregnancy when she was young. He also sort of personalizes a lot of his conversation with her. I'm assuming trying to relate to her because she is young and she is vulnerable. But how does that factor into this, Andrew?
I think that factors in certain regards. It's when it starts to get long and you start to repeat things over and over again, regardless of whether the officer's taking a gentle approach, taking a personal approach, or kind of doing the bad cop sort of routine. When things start to drag on and when things start to be repeated over and over again, I think that's where I see juries tend to have sympathies for the defendants in cases like this.
All right, thanks. And Bob, you know, we were talking about one of the things that the officer had mentioned when he was talking about and asking her about potentially getting an abortion, or if she thought of that or her train of thought with that. And you know, she said that, yeah, I thought about it, but it was too late for me to do anything, so I didn't take that route. Do you think the defense is going to obviously bring that up in their arguments later?
Well, I think the examiner there was trying to get at, did she do things that maybe caused this infant that otherwise would have been viable not to be viable? How that plays legally, whether it's a child or not, unless it's born viable, is a legal issue. But also, it goes against the state's case in the sense that she clearly could have gotten abortion legally. The officer even concedes that to her and even states that to her. And she didn't do that. She didn't even do a lot of research. She was in a state of denial, clearly, is what I think is depicted here for the jurors. And, didn't really know what to do. This thing happened. And then, she just tried to deal with it in the best way she could, that she didn't consciously want this result to happen.
Right. And welcome back to Law and Crime. Right now we're following the trial of Skylar Richardson out of Ohio. Richardson gave birth in the middle of the night, didn't tell anyone, including her brother, who was sleeping across the hall in her house. She ended up taking the baby, burying the baby in her backyard, and then eventually 2 months later when she went to her OBGYN, the OBGYN said, "How's your baby?" And that's when she broke down and said, and explained everything what happened here. So we're talking about this trial right now. We just saw a very in-depth police interview with 2 officers as well as Skylar in a room by herself. So I want to talk about this interview straight off because this is something that a defendant doesn't necessarily have to do. But we know at this point she didn't have a lawyer at the time, so that's likely why she ended up giving this interview to begin with. Andrew, I'll come out to you first. What do you think about her doing this? I mean, obviously you wouldn't ever advise someone to go through this sort of interview.
No, you don't recommend that somebody go through an interview, especially without their attorney being present. It's just not going to be good for you. In fact, when you get the Miranda rights, it says everything you say can be used against you. Technically, under the law, you can't use these statements that you give in court just simply in your favor. So they're using these statements against you. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're allowed to lie to you. They're allowed to manipulate you. They're allowed to keep you essentially until you give up and you say, "I want a lawyer," or you say, "I'm not talking anymore." They can keep you there for just extended periods of time. And they leverage that in all of the different techniques that they use. They tend to get statements that are beneficial to the prosecution as a result of that.
And when we have been watching this interview, do you think that both of these officers here doing the interview, as you said, do you think they used those tactics to leverage and get the answers they wanted? Because they really did not only question her, but also just sort of list out and say plain statements rather than asking her a lot of questions at some points.
Well, they're using many of the techniques that investigators are trained on in terms of how to do an interrogation. The point, I think, is less about them using trickery or lying to her. And we heard just in the last clip a lie in terms of what's going to happen as a result of this. And the detective is saying essentially that she's got no idea. So there are pieces where they're kind of brushing over parts of it. But I think that what the jury responds to most strongly is, who is the person? What is their emotional state? What is their sophistication? Are they a person who is being manipulative, or are they being manipulated? And when you have an 18-year-old, and I can't remember if she was 17 or 18 in this video, but when you have somebody that young who seems to be as immature and as emotional as she is, I don't know that a jury, when confronted with good arguments from a defense counsel in closing arguments, is going to have all that much weight put on what she has to say in that room. Now, I may be wrong, but that's my experience lately, is juries have increasingly low tolerance for these long interviews.
All right. And Bob, watching this interview, one of the things that she repeatedly asks for is when she'll be able to talk to her mom. Can she leave? Will it be over soon? She seems like she wants out of this room. What does that say about her, and how does that factor into the impact of this interview?
Well, with respect to what the court's going to explain later on and what the lawyers are going to argue is going to impact the voluntariness of the statements, or whether she felt confined, and whether she felt she was never going to get out of there and it was reasonable for her to give what they wanted her to give so she could get out. The one question you have to ask yourself is, who's advising her? I mean, they pick her up. The parents don't seem to be anywhere in this equation. She really doesn't have any legal counsel here. And it's clear that the statements are the main part of what the state's case is, at least in terms of the focus on introducing this. What was interesting is in the grand jury phase, I think, the state initially charged her with reckless homicide, and the grand jury actually indicted her on aggravated murder. Now, in a case where we've heard there's maybe some questions as the case goes on about the forensic evidence in this case, the statements play an important role. So what's troubling is, and I agree with Andrew that there are a lot of problems with these tapes, and the credibility and the weight to give it is going to be for the jury to decide. That's their sole province. But you got to wonder and be concerned from the defense standpoint that if this results in the grand jury increasing the charges, what is it going to do for the petty jury in terms of deciding guilt or innocence? And again, that's going to be an issue in this case.
And you mentioned the forensics about this. That is obviously going to be a big part of this. We've seen some of that so far, but especially when we're talking about stillborn or not, the prosecution is saying that the baby was born alive, she killed it. The defense saying, well, the baby was stillborn. They're not denying that she buried it, but that's going to be the big question here, is the stillborn issue. How do you think, what is going to be shown, I guess, to us to figure that out?
Well, I'm not sure. You already have some inkling that there's been some ambivalence in terms of that forensic testimony with respect to whether the body was burned. And of course, the burning would be incidental to the claim by the state that she tried to hide evidence, or evidence of killing the child, and also maybe on its viability. So, you know, that's one issue. But again, getting back to the tapes, you know, the problem with these statements that are being given, you can't cross-examine the statement. You can cross-examine the people who took the statements. And again, the legal aspects of whether this was overreaching by the police has already been decided in this trial. They're coming in, the jury's looking at this now. Maybe an issue for appeal, but the defense is going to have to deal with those statements, and now they're going to have to use cross-examination of the witnesses that obtain those statements to try and undercut what the grand jury may not have seen when it reviewed them.
And Andrew, during this video, we've seen her become very emotional. She's cried. Like we said earlier, she's asked to leave. She wants her mom. Do you think she's showing signs of sympathy at all? Are we getting that she's sympathetic from this video?
I would be surprised if members on the jury don't have some degree of sympathy for her. Now, I think it's going to go both ways, because I think she presents as this unsympathetic kind of millennial type character where she's more concerned about kind of how she looks and whatnot. But when you really dig deep as to what's going on there, I think what you're seeing is a person who's deeply troubled. She's got these eating disorders. She's highly emotional in this situation. I think the whole idea of the pregnancy and whatnot, with her not being able to reveal to people. I mean, she is a deeply troubled individual here. And so the deeper you go into it and the more the defense really plays into it, I think the sympathies will grow.
All right, so it looks like the police officers are back in that room in the live feed. So let's go back to that before the break here. All right, we have a lot to talk about and a lot to break down with this. Right now with me, we have Bob Hille and Andrew Cherkasky. Guys, one of the things that we saw during this is her parents coming into the room. This is after the police officers have left. And this is the first time they're finding out about this with her. So we're seeing their raw reaction, really. What did you think about how they reacted in this room? Andrew, I'll come out to you first.
Well, it's a total setup by the police to get a organic response in terms of what actually happened. And the parents walked in and they said, "What happened? We want the truth." And what she has maintained throughout the entirety of her interaction with her parents seems very organic and seems very real. And she maintains that it was a stillbirth, that the baby wasn't breathing. It's very sympathetic. You feel for her. You feel for the pain that she must have been in. Her parents are not quite cruel over it, but they're worried about how they didn't wake up. Why didn't they know what was going on? Not really concerned for what she must have been going through. So, I mean, ultimately, that's not particularly relevant to the case. The real point is whether the baby was alive or not. But she has maintained over and over and over again, through all of the parents' efforts to get the truth out of her, that that's the truth. So I think that's overwhelmingly beneficial to the defense.
Right. She never says that this baby was viable when it was born, which is really interesting because she's really sticking with the story here. Bob, we have to take a break soon, so I'm not going to get to ask you a question. We only have a few more seconds here. But again, when we come back, we'll continue to be following Skylar Richardson's trial here. This, again, is the woman accused of burying and killing her newborn baby. Stay with us on Law and Crime.